You're listening to the Good Food CFO podcast, where we focus on financial strategies for building a profitable food business. I'm your host, Sarah Delavan. Today on the podcast, I am joined by Adam Pollack. He is the Vice President of Marketing at Rodeo CPG, and together we're discussing the foundational elements of ensuring that your product is viable, and then how you go about ensuring that you can build a profitable business around that product. Whether you're a good food business veteran or you're thinking about launching your first food business, this episode offers up a ton of insightful information. We are talking about what COGS are and how to calculate yours, what a good COGS percentage looks like for a mission-driven food business, the big misconception food business owners have around COGS and volume, how your profit margins are going to change as you grow into new sales channels, and how you can create a realistic and helpful financial model for your business. And that's not all. As I mentioned, this episode is full of value and insightful information. I am so excited for you to listen in. So let's get to it. Adam, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited about this conversation. You and I had a side conversation a couple of months ago where we were getting really passionate about the importance of business owners understanding their unit profitability and how they can go about doing that, but then also how you take that information and utilize it to help ensure that you can actually have a profitable business as well, because a profitable product, as you know, does not guarantee a profitable business. And I thought I just loved the conversation so much. I had to ask you on to kind of have it again so that folks can listen in.
Pumped about it. I'm excited to dive in.
Good. So let's start at the beginning. We like to lay a solid foundation here on the podcast, just in case folks aren't familiar with some of the terminology that we're going to be using. We're talking about COGS, which stands for cost of goods sold. And I want to ask first, let's talk about if someone's launching a new product, right? So let's speak to the business owner or potential future business owner who's thinking about launching a product. Where should they start and what should they be considering at that point?
Yeah. So if you're like most founders, you want to dive right in, and that means doing branding, and that means thinking about marketing, and it means thinking about all this like really sexy, fun stuff. And the reality is like that's great, but these food businesses, like that's not where the success happens. It typically happens around doing two main things really well in the early days. And the first thing is validating your hypothesis. So a lot of founders get this right. They get feedback from their friends and family. They figure out there's a need and that their concept solves a real problem. That piece of it, that's another conversation for a different day. And there's actually a whole methodology around how to do that we cover in one of our resources called Jumpstart. So today we're going to talk about the second main thing you need to get right, which is confirming your product is viable. So let's break that down a little bit. Basically, you want to ensure that based on all of your cost of goods, that like Sarah just mentioned, that term COGS, you can make a sustainable profit and get your product into the market at a price point that makes sense based on the competition. So COGS is really like, I don't know, the bedrock, the cornerstone of a CPG product. And if you can get that right, it's pretty inextricably linked with your profit margins. So the key is really making sure you solve a problem, but making sure that your product is viable and can make money.
So I totally agree with everything that you just said, which is why I'm so happy you're here. When we think about viability, right, and profitable product, you know, in the most basic terms, we're saying we should be able to sell our product for more money than it cost us to make. So let's go again, kind of back to those foundations and talk about what are the things that we should be including when we're calculating our cost of goods for either a new or an existing product at this point, if you haven't done your COGS yet.
Yeah. So just to reiterate, basically, cost of goods is everything that goes into making your product, getting it ready for sale. So those components are your packaging, your ingredients, if you work with a contract manufacturer, they're going to charge you tolling fees, which is basically just, their labor and overhead for producing the product. Or if you're making the product yourself, you obviously want to bake in your labor costs. And if you're in a commercial kitchen, whatever that costs. And then the last thing that's really important is freight in. So that is basically the cost of shipping anything to your manufacturing facility to get the product made. So if you can imagine you have all these raw ingredients coming in from separate suppliers, there's a cost to get them to you to put them together to make your product. So that's another key piece. Sometimes people also include freight out, but Sarah, as kind of the finance guru here, might tell you that goes somewhere else in your calculations. But that's just basically the cost of getting your finished product to its point of sale or to a warehouse for a distributor or something like that. So it's basically when you're just thinking about it roughly, it's all the components that go into getting this product from a bunch of different pieces to that packaged pretty thing that you are pitching to a retailer or that you're selling through your direct-to-consumer site.
Yeah. And a couple maybe words of advice here. I've seen some business owners get super, super detailed in this process where they are factoring in, a percentage of rent for the amount of time that it takes to make a product. You don't have to get that detailed. Your rent is an overhead expense that we will talk about and factor into this big equation sort of later on in the process. If you use a piece of parchment paper, and you're trying to break it down to like the per cookie usage, you don't have to go there. You can certainly calculate your cost of goods for an entire batch and then reduce that down to a per unit cost. So you want to be thorough. You want to get good information, but don't kill yourself. Don't have a wild and crazy spreadsheet where you're doing all sorts of wild mathematics about fractions of rent and things like that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it shouldn't create more work than the work of creating your product. So yeah, within reason, and especially in the early days, you're trying to get to some realistic understanding because that your business is going to be in flux and that's okay, but you just want to make sure like at its core, you're not upside down in the unit economics. Because that's if you're upside down there, then your business is certainly going to be upside down too. And we'll talk about how both your unit economics and your general profitability coexist together a little bit later in this podcast.
Yeah. So I know with 100% certainty that there are folks listening to this right now thinking, well, what should my COGS be? What is a good cost of goods sold, right? Where should I be at? And I know you and I have the very same beliefs on the answer to this question, but I'm going to go ahead and pose it to you. What do you say to those business owners who want to know what a good, COGS percentage or COGS number looks like?
Yeah. So I will reiterate, this will be very different for every business and it will differ by channel. Very, very generally speaking, what we advise is for brands who are starting maybe direct to consumer and have plans to eventually make the shift into retail, that your cost of goods should make up about 50% of your selling price. So for example, with very basic math, if you sell something for $1, your cost of goods should be 50 cents. And that means the other 50 cents is your profit margin. This is all really easy to kind of wrangle when you're selling direct to consumer and you kind of own the whole channel, right? Because you know what you make the thing for, you know what you sell it for. It gets more complex when we start thinking about other channels. And the reason we throw 50% out there is from a retail perspective, you're going to end up losing a lot of that margin to the various fees involved in selling with selling retail. So free fills and chargebacks and slotting fees and all of that. So for instance, if you start with a 20% margin and you end up losing 20% of that margin to the various costs associated with selling in retail, then you're in trouble, right? So that's why 50% gross margin is a great place to start. Ideally, if it could be 80% or 90%, that would be amazing, although we just don't see that very often in the world of consumer packaged food and beverage.
Absolutely. It's such a great point that we cannot stress this enough. On this podcast, we're not going to tell you the be all end all, target COGS percentage for any particular business. It's sort of a benchmark starting point, as you said, Adam. And 50% is a good place to start. But I would encourage folks to know in detail how much of that 50% is made up of your ingredients and your packaging alone, how much of that 50% is associated with labor, and then how much of that labor specifically associated to producing your product, and then how much of that 50% is associated with the shipping and other fees, that might be associated with that making and delivering of your product. You may find when you run your COGS numbers, if you're an existing business, that you're at 40% COGS, right? You might run and see that you're at 52. Doing that work and understanding where you are is super, super key, but we're going to run with this 50% example as we work through the rest of the conversation here. So as you mentioned, Adam, we're thinking right now about direct to consumer, which is where most CPG brands start, right? So we're producing a product for 50 cents and we are selling it for $1, and that's giving us a 50% gross profit margin. Talk a little bit about what happens to that margin when we sell to a retail store. So just to kind of simplify that even further, like really break it down for everybody. You as the business owner are selling to a store, and that store or maybe website is going to resell your product. What happens to our 50% margin in this scenario? And what are some things we should be considering and aware of?
This is where things get a little bit more complex. So for instance, if you want to maintain that $1 price point, then there's got to be some adjustment in your own margin for that. Because for instance, let's say you sell, let's not even tackle distributors just yet. Let's just talk about, you find a one-off retailer who wants to take in your product. They'll let you, bring it in from the trunk of your car, and it's a pretty simple relationship, which I know is where that's where I started. That's where many founders start. So there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to keep your price point at $1, the retailer needs to make money too. So let's assume for your category, their margin is 40%. So all of a sudden, your 50% margin just got cut, down to 10%. And so you need to determine, is that something that's okay for me? Or do I need to have maybe a different retail price than what I sell for on my site? Generally speaking, I think it's best that brands kind of maintain one pretty equal retail price point. Because if, for instance, like your direct-to-consumer site is wildly lower than anything you sell at a retail, then your retailers probably aren't going to be happy. You'll see, there's definitely, you'll notice products are more expensive in Whole Foods than they are on Safeway, and there's a reason for that, and that's okay. But generally speaking, you want to kind of be within some spitting distance of parity for your retail pricing. So that's where you've got to be thinking about, is 50% okay for me? Or do I actually need 70? Because if I'm going to be doing a lot of direct to retailer sales and I give them 40, then I'm still left with 30, which maybe I make it up on volume and it's worth it for me. So to add a layer of complexity to this, let's talk about, you want to sell into retail, but that retailer requires a distributor. So then the distributor needs a margin as well. So let's assume, same example, you've got a $1 price point and you've got a 50% margin. You've got the retailer who needs their 40% margin, and then you've got the distributor now who needs their 20% margin. So you're looking at, there's 60% margin that just kind of got introduced. You had 50, now you're at a negative 10% margin. So you can see how the model kind of breaks there. So you've either got to raise your price point or you've got to figure out how to lower your cost of goods. And so this is where it's really, really just important to understand. And this is why so many brands start direct to consumer. Not only is it simpler, the margins tend to be better, but also, there's a whole host of other reasons why direct to consumer makes sense starting out. You just move a lot faster. You have a better relationship with your customer. That's kind of the main benefit. But you can see here where it's just really important to understand 50%, if you're going to sell direct to consumer for the next year, it may make total sense. And over that span of time, you're going to figure out how, like Sarah said, to go through the 5 or 6 main line items in your COGS and get those down to a point where you can keep your retail price the same and still make the margin that you want from retail. So those are the main considerations to be thinking about, is just that when you introduce another layer to the sales channel, that layer needs to make money. And you just need to make sure that whatever that amount of money is acceptable to your kind of unit model.
Yeah. And so I love this so much because we're really still just talking about unit profitability and ensuring that no matter what sales channel you are selling into, that your product, first and foremost, that product is profitable, that you are making money, whether you're selling to the distributor or you're selling to, a retailer, or you're selling direct to consumer. And so I love just simplifying this and breaking it down and reminding people to think about it. Now I'm getting into the mind of many of my clients and followers, and I think some folks who listen to the podcast. And I know that some of them out there are thinking, well, scale. As my business grows, as I scale, particularly if I'm getting into, retail stores or working with distributors and selling into Whole Foods, for example, my volume is going to go up and I'm going to experience economies of scale, in which case my costs are going to go down and my margins will improve. So I will be fine. I want you to speak to those business owners who might be listening now.
Yeah. So if you're a first time founder, I don't blame you for saying that. If you've done this before, total red flag. Like that, I hear that more than anything I hear from CPG founders, and it couldn't be more wrong. So if you've raised a boatload of money, that's a different thing altogether. Someone has agreed to basically fund your losses for some period of time. But if you're like most CPG founders, you haven't raised a boatload of money because you're kind of in this not even maybe emerging yet, but you're maybe doing a few $100,000 in sales, less than $1 million. And for the most part, those businesses don't raise a boatload of money. Businesses that raise a lot of money are ones that have already kind of proven themselves and are on some trajectory. So I cannot stress this enough. This is like the most common pitfall for early stage brands. You have to start with strong margins. So I've never seen a brand who starts with weak margins get economies of scale and all of a sudden their business, like the model now makes sense. That sort of thing, I don't think exists until you're Kraft or Heinz or General Mills and you're buying garlic by like the ocean tanker full. So the big gains that I see happen in terms of like fixing your unit economics always come from like reworking the model. So that's maybe finding a manufacturer who's twice as efficient. Like for instance, maybe you're doing it today in your kitchen and you flip over to a co-packer and all of a sudden you can do 2, 3, 4, 5 times the volume in the same amount of time. And you've just unlocked a ton of labor, right? That's huge. Or you reformulate. So you realize like, oh, wow, maple syrup is 50% of my product and it is outrageously expensive. So maybe I can flip over to half stevia or, something else like that. But that's where we see like when margins are a little bit busted, it's always something around reworking the process, not when I'm selling 10 million, my margins are going to be bigger. Because it just, most of the time, the brand that doesn't have the margin, they try to get to 10 million as fast as they can. And because their margin is so thin, they get crushed by all these retailer costs that I mentioned to start. So they say yes to every retailer to get to that revenue target where they're going to unlock all this margin expansion. And what they find is all the selling costs related to selling in retail are just like totally like a death blow. Like they just didn't foresee that they'd have to free fill all these retailers, that they'd have spoilage, that they'd have all these different deductions. And then they spread themselves too thin. And that's usually the end. That's it. So you have to start, if your product does not have strong margins, rethink it. There's always a way to rework the model. And you might have to make some sacrifices. You might have to make some adjustments, but I can't say this more strongly. If you're operating at a 10% margin when you hand over the PO to your co-packer for that first 10,000 unit run, don't figure out how to rework things so that you have more room in that margin because you're going to need it. I've never seen a brand say, "Oh, we have too much margin. Like we don't know what to do with all this money." It's never been the case. So.
Yeah, I love everything you said so much. One of the core things that I talk about that a lot of people have a strong initial reaction to is the best way to improve profitability is not necessarily by growing your sales, right? And exactly what you just said. If your margins are too low, right, not high enough, and you get into relationships where you're selling a ton of product, perhaps, right? You're selling your product by the pallet, but it's actually going to cost you money to do it. Having more sales is actually negatively impacting your profitability. And I think that this is such a big core thing that people need to understand.
Yeah, this exact thing happened to me. I was the like young, naive, first-time founder, a lot of hubris. I was selling a product that was selling exceptionally well, and we were losing money on every single unit. So the more we sold, the more we lost. And it was a bootstrap business, so there wasn't this war chest I'm talking about. It was terrifying, and I had to go to my retailers and say, like, we're done. And they're like, we don't understand, you're selling so well, why would you want to be done? And I obviously like couldn't explain the particulars, but it's a thing that happens all the time. And most brands think like, oh, this is what I need to do, this is like the path to success. And what we find is brands tend to be very hell-bent on growth at all costs, top line revenue growth, getting into more stores, when in reality they should be much more focused on bottom line growth and making sure that if they are taking on new retailers, those retailers support the bottom line. So most brands don't think they can say no to retailers. You can always say no. And if they want you today, they'll probably want you in 6 months when your model works a little bit better. So you can say no, especially if you know it's going to put you in a position where the economics don't make any sense. So that's a big thing. It's probably the number one thing we see brands get wrong the first time around is saying yes to every retailer, even though it doesn't make sense from a unit perspective.
Yeah. And like several other things that we talk about here on the podcast in general across episodes, it's not that it's just a misguided belief. And it's almost like we don't know where the source of this information came from that your margins will improve with volume, right? And sometimes I ask clients like, at what is that volume? If you don't know specifically what that point is, it might be not until you've got shiploads of raw ingredients coming in, and that's going to take a really long time for you to get to potentially. Our focus first and foremost when we're working with young or about to launch or even 2, 3, 4-year-old businesses is to get you to survive those first 3 to 5 years, but not only survive, thrive, and then be set up to succeed and be really successful. So I think your advice is super on point for sure. The other thing I want to mention before we move on is this idea of investment. And as you said, you want to prove your concept, prove the viability of your business, right? I think really before you take on that investment. And we have seen in our work businesses that haven't worked out the margins, they haven't gotten it right. They've done a great job at selling their concept and their idea and the future of their business, but the investment just funds more debt in a way, right? It's funding losses because they're, like you said, growing sales, and with every sale you're losing a bit of money. So we see investment received, I want to say like too early, before the business really has it sorted out and knows exactly how they're going to turn that investment money into more money. The outcomes are sometimes negative. So I think it's a good thing to share. And I'm so glad that you shared your personal story. I think that's super helpful.
Yeah. And this just goes back to, there's two main things. It's what I kicked off with these businesses. It's you got to validate your hypothesis, which I said most founders are really good at, and most founders can actually go and raise money on. But the second thing is you have to confirm the product is viable. And this is where CPG is very different than tech, which there's a lot of money flowing into CPG, a lot of it from tech. And that's where like you're making a physical thing that is really complex and has a ton of different pieces to it. It's not like simply redesigning a site or a piece of software when things go wrong. And there's just no way to do this in a way that's not expensive, because you have physical hard costs and you have these very long cash cycles from the time you invest in those raw ingredients to the time you ever get paid back from a retailer, assuming you go the retail route. Direct to consumer is a little better. So that's where like this whole piece around viability, around making sure that the thing makes money, is really, really important for CPG. And I just cannot stress that enough, that like It's not enough to just say like people are buying this thing. We've proven product market fit. It's got to work economically too, and that's just something that as a first-time founder you are not thinking about, because if people are handing you money, you think you figured it out, like you've got it. So that just it's a hard lesson learned from starting two of these businesses, and it's the lesson I still see again and again. CPG founders just they don't you don't know what you don't know when you start, and it's like the number one thing I see that gets first-time founders into trouble.
Yeah. So once we've got the information locked in, right? We know what our costs are. We've calculated our cost of goods sold. We've included everything. We've determined a direct to consumer price point that also works on the, I'll call it the wholesale level. So selling direct to a retailer, and then on the distributor level, meaning you're selling to a distributor who's then selling to a retailer who's then selling to the end consumer. You've done that work to say, okay, the price point makes sense. All the math works out for me to be profitable on a product level at within each of these channels. Remembering, I'm kind of like making like an asterisk with my fingers, remembering that on top of what the distributor is taking as their standard fee, you're going to have all of those costs that Adam pointed out, like slotting fees or free fills, just various fees that different distributors will send your way. So just be conscious of those things. And if you aren't sure what they are, seek help from someone like Adam or someone like myself or a fellow business owner who's been there and can provide you with some insight into what those costs might look like. When you've got that information, right, you have the ability to say, if I sell one unit in each channel, this is how much my gross profit margin will be. And this is how much my dollar profit margin will be on that gross profit level. Now we want to know, how many units do I think I can sell? How many do I need to sell to have I'll call it a hearty gross profit margin, both in terms of really in terms of dollars, but also kind of in percentage as well. We want to think about this. And the reason I bring this up is because after you've got the viable product, you've proven to yourself that the math works out. It's so critical to understand how many units do I have to sell in order to cover all the costs of running a business, right? At the end of the day, at the very least, we want to be paying ourselves a decent wage from our business, right? We want to be able to pay our team well if we have one. We've of course got to cover our operating expenses, and we want a little bit of money left over at the end of the month, at the end of the year. In addition, most business owners or most businesses are carrying some level of debt that will need to be paid back. So that first step of proving product viability is so critical, but then we want to talk about how do we ensure that at those price points and at those margins, we can build a business that is profitable. So Adam, I have a question for you, and this is sort of off script, if you will. Do you have any like guidelines or insights into how a business owner might think about sales projections, or what I might sell D2C, or I know that some business owners struggle with this concept of projecting sales units and sales revenue.
I'll be totally transparent and say it's a crapshoot, especially if you're just starting out. Every forecast I've ever seen has never been right. What I think is important to get right, not to sound like a broken record, is overestimate what you think your costs are going to be and underestimate what you think your revenue is going to be by 50%, 100%, too much, because every single forecast I've ever seen wildly overestimates revenue and wildly underestimates costs. I would say for me, what's always like a bit alarming, I look at a lot of pitch decks. I always look at like SG&A. So basically, like, what are the salaries? What kind of like overhead in people is a brand carrying? And if that number is like super high for a small brand, that's a little bit worrisome to me. So I think, like, generally speaking, you have to stay lean. But Sarah's right. Like, you don't want to work for free forever. You got to get to a place where you're paying yourself and that the business supports that. I think in some ways it's actually easier to, when it comes to forecasting direct to consumer, I think it's just an insane challenge starting out. It's because there's no visibility into what other brands are doing. And you just have to make some, what I think are very conservative assumptions around, you have to do some testing around, what your customer acquisition costs look like, what seems like a realistic amount of people you can get to your site every day, and then what can you close with those people. So that's, I think, incredibly challenging. The retail piece, that's actually something we do a lot of work with on the Rodeo front, and something we are building tools to help automate. But we always think about these bottoms up sales plans. So what you see a lot of brands do is when it comes to forecasting retail, they say, well, it's a $200 million marketplace and we can get 1% of that, which is always outrageous. That's never how it works. But that's what a lot of brands do. Instead, we recommend going the other way, which is to say, okay, your product, you think it should sell in these retailers. So let's list those retailers out. Let's put a conservative estimate on your ability to close them over the next 12 months. So you'll close some of them, you won't close others. And then once you're in them, let's think about when those closes happen. So you can start thinking about when the revenue might hit. And then once you're in them, in the world of retail, it's pretty easy to know, what are the category targets? Every category and every retailer has certain what are called velocity targets. That's just a fancy word for, we expect this number of units to sell per week for this given category in this given retailer. So bars are going to be different than sauces. Bars, the expectations are much higher. Anything in the refrigerated section is very high expectations as well. So the idea would be you would kind of build from the bottom up, thinking about, I know the retailers I want to be in over the next 12 months, assigning a very realistic close percentage against which ones you think you can actually close. And then hopefully with conversations with buyers, getting to an understanding of, okay, I've got to sell 10 units a week to stay in this spot. So that's what I got to do if I'm going to be in these retailers. And then you could kind of start backing into what a revenue number looks like for the year and a profit number and all that. So it really just is dependent on your specific journey, because if you say for the next 12 months, I just want to be direct to consumer, that's a different forecast than in the next 6 months, I'd like to be in a region of Whole Foods and these 50 independents. So I don't have a general rule of thumb. All I can say is costs are more important than revenue starting out. Because if you have a pot of money to start with and you can make it last, as Sarah said, for a little bit longer, that's huge. So really trying to nail those costs is key. And then for retail, kind of thinking about that bottoms up approach, as opposed to, because that's another big red flag for me when I see a pitch deck, is the market size is $100 million and we're going to get 5% of it in the next 2 years. It's never the way it works. This is why we actually do this work individually with lots of clients, because it's so specific to their own journey and when they want to launch DTC, when they want to launch in retail, and which retailers they want to launch into.
Yeah, I love that approach. There are a lot of folks who think, I'll call it top down in a sense, where who are the people, who do I want to be selling to? And just like you said, who are they and how many units will we move? And setting that target, I think it's helpful for two reasons. One, it's helpful to see what is my sort of potential revenue realistically over this time frame. And also I think it can serve as a strategy tool, right? Who am I approaching? Who have I contacted? What are my close ratios, right? You can kind of utilize this list you've created in that way as well. I'll present, I don't want to say alternative, but just another way to look at things, which is a little more bottom up, if you will. So let's say, for example, you don't have a lot of money in the bank, right? Let's say, it's a bootstrapped business. We've invested some money. We've gotten ourselves started up, and we don't have a lot to work with. So maybe our goal is to be as sustainable as possible, or to limit the amount of debt that we have to take on over the next 12 months, right? What we want to do is, as Adam mentioned, understand our operating costs, right? The salaries, what is our overhead? What are the things that we absolutely have to have in place to run our business? That might be rent for you, if you are producing your own product, right? And you've got your manufacturing facility, whether you pay hourly or you pay by the month. It might be your team members that you need on board to produce your product, right? just all of those things, you want to understand what they are. Just list them out in a spreadsheet, right? And assign either an annual number to it if you just want to think big picture, or a monthly number to it if you want to lay it out month by month. When you've got these core costs that you cannot go without paying, what I like to do then is I'm sort of like creating a spreadsheet mentally in my mind. Above that, you've got your COGS percentages, right? Or even I like to work in percentages with COGS, because then if you say, I'm going to make $1,000 in revenue this month, you know exactly how much of that $1,000 is going to go to COGS for each of those channels. And we talk about that a little bit more in in our private community on Mighty Network. So if you want to kind of talk through that in more detail, I'm happy to do that with you there. But so you've got your fixed costs either on a monthly or an annual basis. You've got your COGS percentages understood. And then you can go about just sort of playing with the numbers and saying, how much money do I need to make per month? Or do I need to make over the next 12 months to hit this initial goal of sustainability in the business, or losses that don't exceed $10,000, right? If that's what you can sustain financially. And then once you've got that number translated into a number of units, right? And then just understand, how many units is this? Okay, who am I going to sell them to? And so you're sort of like backing into your plan that way. This approach works really well for the folks who are like, I have no idea how to approach sales projections from a revenue standpoint. We sort of back you into like, here's your minimum goal to achieve the financial goals that you want to hit. So I think that can be another kind of sort of creative, but also fairly solid way of getting into a projection. And that's going to help you understand the viability of your business, right? Like if you take either one of the methods that Adam and I just laid out, and the number of, the amount of revenue that you have to bring in, or the number of units that you have to sell for your business as a whole to be viable, is scary to you, or seems overwhelming to you, or you have some sort of emotional response to that that's not totally positive, I think it's a good opportunity to sort of take a beat and really think about that, and really think about, is everything within my model structured the way that it needs to be, or the best way possible?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's about the soundest thinking I've ever heard around how to do this with like no actual data. If that's where you're at in the early days, I think your approach is totally spot on. You need a plan. Your plan is going to change as you go from idea to actual execution, but you need some North Star. This is like the famous, I think it's Gus D'Amato quote, who is Mike Tyson's trainer. Everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face. And like, that's totally true. You can't launch one of these businesses and not have some grounding in, I know what I need to sell in units, or I know what I need to bring in dollars to make this whole thing work. So yeah, I mean, you've got to keep yourself honest. And then, this should be a quarterly exercise where you're revisiting your plan and making sure like, oh, wow, actually my business exploded. So I need to I can rethink this, or my business isn't where I wanted it to be 3 months ago. So I need to rethink this. So I think that's the key here, is like, you make the plan and know it's going to change, and then just revisit it and change it as your business changes.
Totally agree. I love it so much. I say this every episode. I could talk to you forever. I think this is a super important topic, and I really enjoy digging into it with you. But podcast episodes have, time limits. So maybe we'll have you inside. I know. Maybe we'll have you inside the Profitable Food Business group. We'll do like maybe a live event or something fun like that, and we can maybe field some questions from listeners. I think that would be really awesome. But in the meantime, where can folks find you, and tell us a little bit about the tools and resources that you have at Rodeo CPG to support founders?
Sure. Yeah. So you can find us on Instagram at Rodeo CPG, or on LinkedIn as well. Rodeo at its core is a services company. So we help emerging food and beverage brands basically with three main things: product development from an idea to an actual finished concept. We do a lot of operations work. So finding co-packers, 3PLs, setting up supply chains, installing inventory management systems. And then we do some sales as well. So I mentioned we do a lot of go-to-market strategy, pricing strategy, brands who are in retail and kind of looking to optimize, or brands who are looking to be in retail and just have never done that before and need sort of a trusted advisor to help them understand what that craziness looks like, because it is, selling in retail is just a different beast altogether. And then what I have been working on personally is something more specific to very, very early stage brands. So those are the brands that I started, and the brands I started, unfortunately, couldn't afford Rodeo back in the day. So I created a bunch of tools and kind of a program called Jumpstart, which is all around kind of your first year, pre-launch and going into kind of your first year. And so I'm actually breaking it apart into a bunch of different modules and a la carte tools, so people have even more optionality around it. But the basic idea is it's a lot of our thinking and experience and tools and stuff that we've used for hundreds of clients and seen success with, packaged up in a way that's much friendlier to first time early stage entrepreneurs. So Jumpstart, I'm sure we can link to it in the show notes or something, but we have a bunch of tools that help with, actually specifically, I'm building out an early stage COGS tool, a in-store promotions ROI tool, and a kind of retail pricing tool that actually helps you understand, if I'm selling direct to consumer versus retail versus selling to a distributor, what does my pricing need to look like? Does it need to adjust? What are my margins? So a lot of the things we talked about today, we help brands with in a very high touch way. And then we also have tools that are very reasonably priced that people can pick up off the shelf and help them with these very complex things. So you can find us at Rodeo CPG, and definitely I think Jumpstart's really relevant here. So I'm sure Sarah can throw in a link to that.
Definitely will. Well, before we sign off, any last words on product viability or profitability or COGS, or just a final little message for our listeners?
No, I mean, I think we really covered it. I think in a past life, I was a CPG entrepreneur. I know how hard it is. Typically, when I have a one-to-one conversation with someone, I'll tell them, like, I don't intend for this to be the last conversation I have with you. The door is now open, and you can feel free to email me as much as possible. So I was fortunate to have a lot of people who helped me along the way when I was a founder, and I'm thrilled to do the same.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I think this information and episode are full of valuable information for folks. So I appreciate you, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me, Sarah. This was great.
This episode of the Good Food CFO podcast is sponsored by Sarah Delavan Consulting's Profit Assessment online course. This online course puts you in control of understanding your finances and making a plan to achieve your goals. Inside the course, you will learn exactly how to define your annual and quarterly goals based on your unique vision. Analyze your business's finances with our easy-to-use profit assessment template, and establish your financial success formula and financial rollout plan. When you enroll, you get immediate access to our easy-to-use profit assessment template, financial rollout planner, and strategy finder. You also get access to our exclusive online platform and the Good Food CFO online network, plus a bonus vision and goal-setting workshop. Visit sarahdelavan.com or thegoodfoodcfo.com to learn more and enroll.